Welcome to Ideagen TV. Today we have with us Maurizio Vecchione, Chief Innovation Officer for the Terasaki Institute, co-founder of AdAstral Ventures, and also the chair of the Washington Global Health Alliance. Maurizio, welcome.
George, how are you? Thank you very much for having me on. Slight correction so that my boss, the chair of the Global Health Alliance, doesn't fire me. I'm actually the chief executive, and she is the chair. So, chair and chief executive. So you are the chief executive officer. So you know what? That just demonstrates the breadth and depth of the impact that you're making. And you have so many titles, and it's not by accident. And what's exciting about today is that, Maurizio, we consider you the voice of reason, the person who we reach out to for trusted information in terms of what's happening globally on a macro perspective and also on a micro perspective. And so I'd like to dig deep right off the start of this interview by asking you, as Chief Innovation Officer for the Terasaki Institute, how are you and your team implementing innovation to design the future of the biomedical field?
Well, so first of all, thank you for those kind words. You know, the vision that moves me, which I think is also the vision that works well for the institutions that I work with, is one that we do live in an age of unprecedented challenges. You know, all we need to do is take a look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN to sort of look at the planetary scale issues that also affect the population scale issues, to understand that, you know, there seems to be a compounding set of challenges. But on the other hand, we also live in an age of unprecedented innovation that provides new levers, new tools to solve some of those challenges. And so, you know, what's exciting to me every single morning when I wake up is the fact that if we play our cards right, we have the ingredients to do the kind of moonshots, and perhaps in this day and age, we should call them Mars shots, to actually move the needle on these great global challenges that ultimately are going to produce a better planet. And I am an optimist in that perspective. You know, there is a tendency, unfortunately, in part because we do receive so much information nowadays, there's a tendency to think about the world as a place that is getting worse. And, you know, if you turn on the news, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you a lot of good news. But when you actually look at it in terms of the key metrics and key indicators, the world is actually getting better. If you take, for example, chronic and extreme poverty, you know, we have more than halved extreme poverty over the last 2 decades. If you look at childhood mortality, you know, we are making major dents across the landscape of disease. And even in the much maligned climate and climate tech, as much as the planet is clearly under stress, there is also some significant movement forward, especially with a convergence of new technologies and new science as a tool that can sort of help us move forward. So you asked a question about innovation. And to me, innovation is nothing but the curation of the sciences, the technologies, and the breakthroughs, sometimes called moonshot thinking, that are essentially addressed to some of the most important problems in the world. And the importance of innovation in a research institute like the Terasaki Institute is that most of the new science, most of the discoveries, most of the things that are really exciting inside a research laboratory don't actually matter until they are translated into things that touch patients or that can be implemented. And the process of innovation is really that translation. How do you make sure that these scientific breakthroughs make their way into products that ultimately save lives or impact lives?
And that is my definition of innovation. And to some extent, that is what an institute like the Terasaki Institute is focused on doing. It's using academic rigor to essentially catalyze breakthroughs in the biomedical space in this case. But then it's using industry and industrial processes to translate them into something that at the end of the line, you and I can use if we are the patients that need it. And that is a trend that is actually accelerating.
What an incredible trend, and certainly reason for optimism. And that was my point in opening up the interview. This optimism that you exude based on the reality that you're seeing on the ground and across the planet. I think that's the message here. And you mentioned innovation as well. So the use of innovation for good is really something of a hot topic today, right? We're in this age of technology, innovation. Things are changing so quickly. Everything from cryptocurrency to the biomedical field to finance, everything is being swept up in this new era of innovation, especially relating to technology. And we've seen recently from Terasaki that you all are working on personalized nutrition, which would, in essence, individualize 3D printable nutritional snacks and the development and design of personalized protein and food resources. Maurizio, could you share with our global audience how you and your team are actually executing on what is beyond incredible in terms of innovation?
Well, let me first of all suggest that we're certainly not the only ones thinking about these issues, right? But when you look at planetary scale problems, one of the many problems and one of the many impacts of the changing climate is the fact that the same food grown in the same place today is not going to give you the nutrition that the same food grown in the same place was giving you yesterday. And those trends are compounding. So how we're going to feed a 10 billion people planet in the not too distant future is a problem that is in the list of sort of global challenges. And on top of it is not just the population growth that presents the problem, is the fact that the changes in the planet itself, climate and otherwise, are making the sustainability of agriculture and other practices suspect. And one of those places where you have this sort of grand convergence of issues is the whole subject of creating protein. So even setting aside the ethical consideration about slaughtering animals for food and any of those kind of things, the simple reality is that if you take a 10 billion people planet and you use conventional, say, ranching and farming techniques for the creation of meat and protein, and you project forward a few decades, we're going to run out of land. We're going to run out of water. We're going to run out of all of the critical inputs. And, jokingly the other day, I said to someone, we better start teaching cows how to swim because they're not going to have the land and we're not going to be able to have the sustainable volume to feed that 10 billion people planet. So when you look at a problem like that, there are a number of things the science can help you do. One of them is to look at a better, more ethical, but also more sustainable way of producing perfect protein, and one that doesn't involve killing animals. And, all of these sort of early history where you had products that are meat substitutes, those are baby steps in comparison to what the science allows you to do today. We are at the point where you can put modern proteomics, modern tissue engineering, modern system biology. You can utilize cell cultures and stem cells to literally copy and create in an industrial process what would normally happen in the body when an animal develops. And you can do that without ever passing through the animal. And so you can use 3D printing and tissue engineering techniques and to essentially synthesize perfect proteins with the ideal features to make sustainable nutrition, and even to make them personalizable so that you can optimize for the nutritional profile of an individual. And you can do that using modern science entirely in an industrial process. Now, is it a substitute to, say, real meat? No, it's actually real meat. It's just not grown in an animal. And so it, if you go back to Star Trek and you think about the food synthesizers that they had, well, this is sort of the modern real equivalent of those kind of products. And this is reality in the laboratory today. And it's reality with a number of these sort of convergent sciences around system biology and stem cell technology. The problem, of course, has been that the cost factors associated with all of these kind of things have typically not compared very well with slaughtering animals and doing things the normal way. And I think this is where I'm excited that we are at the cusp of seeing some real progress, because, not just at the Terasaki Institute, but there are some breakthroughs that are for the first time allowing us to produce a food and protein of the type that I've just described in a laboratory or in an industrial process at a cost that rivals, if not even beats, the commercial production cost for commercial meat. And you do that again without the environmental footprints that are associated with it, which means you can scale it and sustain it in a much more effective way. So that's what this whole project is about, and we call all of this part of what we call personalized nutrition, and it's really sort of the future of food and thinking about how food will work, in a 21st century that has the advantages coming out of modern genomics and many other omics, as sort of background sciences.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask, I think what struck me is the level of acceleration of the science. And I'd like your perspective, Maurizio. Have you seen with the pandemic and the Operation Warp Speed and all the projects that came across to deliver vaccines in by all accounts, record time, are you seeing an acceleration that then is benefiting the projects you're describing? Or have we been set back in some way by the pandemic? I mean, specifically relating to the science aspect of it all.
Yeah. So I don't think the political environment that brought you Operation Warp Speed as an example is necessarily accelerating the science, but it did accelerate the translation of the science into a product, right? So what I think the lesson that you can derive from the whole sort of fast track vaccine development is that it shows you what can happen when government, private sector, and science all sort of collaborate against a common goal. Okay. And so we didn't necessarily, the discoveries that brought you many of the core vaccines in record time, for example, the mRNA, so-called mRNA technology, those discoveries had occurred, and they were part of the sort of ongoing scientific revolution around the sort of convergent, primarily life sciences technologies that I described to you before, and we can come back to that. And so we are in the midst of probably not one, but probably 5 scientific revolutions that are creating sort of a backlog of scientific opportunities. But then it took the government to streamline some of the regulatory processes. It took the pandemic to create an urgent need. It took a number of other things to essentially add fuel and translate those discoveries into something practical, in this case, the vaccines, okay? And so I think there is a lesson in that. And I hope the lesson is not
is not that we need a pandemic or an emergency to actually do something useful with the science that is accumulating. But the lesson might just be that these large problem sets that we're facing, whether it's the planetary scale problems that I described a minute ago around climate and food and potential challenges as the population grow, whether it's, the various attempts to move off the planet and start thinking in ambitious terms about space, or whether it is diseases that are presenting specific challenges. We're having an almost endemic epidemic surge of certain chronic diseases, and almost every type of healthcare system that projects forward into the future will tell you that if we don't get a grasp on these sort of chronic diseases, the diabetes and cardiovascular diseases of the world, we're going to bankrupt whichever healthcare system we choose to. Yet problems could become accelerants to this sort of translational effort. And I think that's again, this idea that we should stop thinking about these problems as daunting and not resolvable, and we should start seeing them as call to actions to actually deploy the resources that are needed so that by solving these problems, we actually can leapfrog and see the dawn of entire new industries and new potential. The food example I gave you a minute ago, well, if you actually look at the investment landscape for that sector, this whole cultivated meat sort of idea is already booming in terms of venture capital and other investments. And there are literally dozens of companies that have been formed just in the last 3 or 4 years that are starting to move down this landscape, including some that have already achieved billion-dollar sort of valuations. So, this is a long-winded way of saying that these big problems are not just a catalyst for scientific innovation, but they are also potentially an opportunity to build the great companies of tomorrow. And I think the business sector, and I think government and investors, as well as scientists and entrepreneurs, should view these problems as sources of inspiration to essentially design the winning strategies for the next few decades.
Maurizio, what incredible perspective, and what an incredible time. I love your reference to Mars shots as opposed to moon shots as well, and I think that's what we're talking about here. And it'd be great to think in terms of the accelerants and the focus and the cross-sector collaboration that you and I have talked so much about over the years. I think it takes that cross-sector approach and the regulatory scheme and the streamlining of that in order to allow for that innovation really to fester and to foster. And so, continuing off that question, can you share more of your research you're all working on that will help ultimately to achieve our favorite topic, which is the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations?
Sure. Well, I told you quite a bit about the role of sort of biology and life sciences in creating sort of this new ecosystem that could provide solutions to some of these issues. But when you actually look at it more holistically, we're also witnessing the impact of digital technologies and data science specifically into all of these other omics and related. I think everybody has seen what happens when you can decode the genome, the human genome, and when you can start using genetics in the context of data science to predict disease, to identify risk factors, to look for biomarkers, etc. But now imagine doing that on a much wider scale across not just the genomic side, but the metabolomics side, the proteomics side. And, imagine ultimately getting to the idea of building drugs in silico, where you can discover the next drug not by
running almost random high throughput screening against animal models, but instead you can begin designing the likely match between molecules and targets directly in the computer. And we are rapidly approaching the time when you can do that. And one of the key enablers to that is the ability to essentially take a human tissue, maybe even a human organ, and place it on a chip so that you can actually create assays that test that real tissue as they would in reality if you gave the drug candidate to a real human being. But you're doing that in vitro, as and essentially testing the real human response as opposed to trying to infer the human response from an animal model. And most people don't realize that, but the chances that something that works in an animal ends up working in a human being is in general less than 7%. So the reason why we have so many failures to translate drugs that may appear promising is really that the human models are quite different than the animal models. And if you could sort of skip that stage and go directly to humanized tissue, including personalized tissue, where you're actually putting on a chip a copy of your cancer or my cancer or the real patient's cancer, and you can actually measure the testing, that's really opening up a new dawn of what I would describe as precision medicine. And I think it's likely to be at the core of where the big discoveries in biopharma are going to come in the next decades. And so the technology to do these, not only organs on a chip, but now increasingly human on a chip, where you're looking at multiple organs working together, all in sort of a chip system that can then be tested using big data science and tested against candidate molecules. That's again reality in the lab at the moment, and is beginning the journey of crossing over into a new way of designing drugs. And we think that that's extremely exciting, and it's about to unleash solutions to, I think, some really daunting problems that have escaped classic approaches to drug discovery.
And with all of this acceleration, Maurizio, you're right at that edge. You're seeing it all converge, and with all of the different sort of leadership roles you're involved in right now. What an incredible time! And along with innovation for good, AI for good is another hot topic. AI for good. Will you be able to share with our global audience a little bit about how you're using AI for good? And if you have any case studies, even better.
Sure. Well, one of my prior projects that I did on behalf of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation effort related to beginning to look at intractable problems in specific disease conditions through the power of predictive disease modeling, as well as sort of completely changing the way you approach addressing a specific disease. And a case study that I'm fond of mentioning is the work that we pioneered on cervical cancer. So, what's interesting about cervical cancer is a disease that has its roots in an infection, in the HPV virus. And there exists now a vaccine for HPV, which in theory, once it becomes widespread, will eliminate the onslaught of cervical cancer. On the other hand, that vaccine is not effective on any woman that was already infected with the HPV virus. And so, the question that we asked ourselves as a sort of problem statement is going to be, probably a few decades before you have prevalence of the vaccine on a global basis. And what are you going to do about the millions of women that, especially in the developing world, don't have access to modern screening and potentially the interventions that are necessary if they develop precursors and ultimately cervical cancer? And so, and what we realized is that in most parts of the world that are middle income or lower income, and by the way, those include places like China, where the healthcare system is quite sophisticated, but women are simply not screened annually for cervical cancer. And so our moonshot was to think about having a diagnostic system that could be used anywhere, frankly, by relatively low training primary care type of staff, including non-physician trained staff, and that could, with one visit, provide a predictive assessment of whether a woman was likely to progress to cervical cancer. And it turns out that by creating the right data set, and we partnered with the National Cancer Institute to do that sort of work, a piece of artificial intelligence or machine learning using a simple photograph from a camera phone turns out to have discovered a new biomarker that allows better predictive value of that assessment than even the most advanced molecular tests that are in existence in the West. And that became a real sort of example of how the machine or the computer, using techniques like machine learning, can find correlations and, in this case, discover biomarkers that, for all the sophistication of sort of clinical science to date, were undiscovered before. And so, to me, what's really exciting about this convergence around data and AI and all the other underlying sort of scientific techniques, again, genomics and all the other omics, is that you have the opportunity to discover completely new biomarkers. And new biomarkers means you're going to have new ways of predicting and detecting disease, hopefully much sooner, which then allow you to do interventions much sooner and at a lower cost, and perhaps with much higher efficacy. And I think the cancer space is chock full of that. I think lifestyle diseases like cardiovascular and diabetes and so on is chock full of those opportunities. And I think, frankly, they're going to make for fantastic companies as those things execute. So AI for good to me doesn't mean just save some money or automate processes for which we have solutions today, but it really means, how do we use these new techniques in conjunction with other techniques to essentially go into uncharted ground to discover new medicine.
How incredibly exciting, Maurizio. I mean, this is, in light of all the other news, on the evening news every day, this is actually very good news and very promising news. And I'd like to switch gears because you're not one-dimensional. You have a multi-dimensional career, and it's awe-inspiring. I'll tell you, it's awe-inspiring. And I'd like to switch gears a bit to say that not only are you the CIO of Terasaki Institute, but you're also the president and CEO of the Washington Global Health Alliance. And I'm hoping you can share a bit of insight, a little bit of line of sight into what the Washington Global Health Alliance does and how you are all using this technology and innovation to carry out what is undoubtedly an incredible mission.
Sure. Well, the word Washington comes from the fact that, while I think undoubtedly your viewers are quite aware of the role and importance of, say, Silicon Valley to tech development, or of, other geographical areas like the Boston community in the biotech sector, et cetera, very quietly, but very impressively over the last few decades, really starting with some institutions that found Seattle as their home including the Gates Foundation, including organizations like PATH. There's been a community, some people would like to call it the Silicon Valley, of the global health community that has sprung out of that Seattle and Washington State community. So even though Washington State is a small state in the northwest part of the country, it is actually the capital of a lot of the innovation that relates to global health. And you might say, okay, what's the difference between global health and health? Well, think of global health as population scale issues, and think of global health as healthcare for everyone, regardless of borders, right? And a failure to deliver proper global health on a planetary scale brought us to the current pandemic cycles. And a success of global health is the vaccines that we're all starting to take. So these are very topical issues, and global health is a lot more than chasing rare diseases in faraway parts of the world. It's increasingly becoming health. And by the mainstream delivery, as well as innovation and technology, increasingly we are becoming aware of the lack of equity in healthcare access in this country, in many other countries. Increasingly, we're looking at diseases like lifestyle diseases that are a result of that lack of equity. If you think about the fact that whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the incidence of many of the top global burden of diseases, certain populations and certain genders and certain subgroups are suffering from those diseases in unprecedented way. There's this sort of element of what are we doing, not only in developing these technologies, but then in making these technologies accessible and available on a global basis. All of these present challenges, but also present opportunities. And so the Washington Global Health Alliance was originally started to federate this group of incredible institutions that were primarily on the research and sort of implementation science of these trends, but ultimately became a cohesive group that now spans the globe. So despite the word Washington, we're open for business for everyone that is interested in these topics. And it's become an incredible engine for innovation and coordination. And you talked about the importance of coordination before. Many of these really big problems require the convergence of many specialties and many approaches. And so the Alliance really is attempting to bring together the stakeholders that can deliver that grand convergence, and including government and multilateral organizations, funders, including funders that are on the private side, industry, and ultimately, academic and research institutions, so that there could be a very deliberate sort of move the needle type approach on all of these things. And if you're kind of hearing a common theme on the things that I believe in and that I'm working on, is, I really do believe that the grand solutions to these problems are going to be driven by these collaborative approaches with a heavy emphasis on translation and a partnership between private capital and industry and public good entities. And, all three of the organizations that you mentioned that are part of my ecosystem, are deeply committed to that.
Well, and that's really what's inspiring, because, for a leader like yourself to understand and embrace the cross-sector collaboration and not have that I can do it alone mentality, which many leaders do have, and that's okay for their specific purpose, but for the global purpose, for the purpose that you're working toward, to make the world a better place and ultimately to change the world, your leadership is incredible, because you're embracing that cross-sector approach again. And so, yeah.
Well, and thank you for saying that. Let me also say that, at a time when we are sometimes questioning the role of big philanthropy and even the role of government into sort of moving the needle in this problem solving, this sort of cross-sector and interdisciplinary collaboration and this sort of approach of chasing moonshots or Mars shots but at the same time doing them for good, for the benefit of humanity. It also has a hidden benefit, which is, and this is something that, in my own experience of doing moonshots over the last few decades, inevitably the kind of things that solve these really big, gnarly global problems are also the kind of things that, if solved, can scale to incredible proportions. And right there is sort of my message that chasing these big problems is not just the ethical, humanitarian thing to do, but it's actually a great business strategy to create the great companies of tomorrow. And so at a time when the venture capital industry, for example, is struggling to find what they call the unicorns of tomorrow, to find the great companies that have incredible scale and become highly disruptive, well, all you have to do is look at who's bringing the solutions to being for these problems that are essentially global and planetary, to find essentially the business strategies that if they're successfully executed, will return to investors social capital, but will also return to investor incredible financial capital. And so to me, there's nothing wrong with using these problem sets as a call to action to marshal industry to do some great and phenomenal things that ultimately lead to sustainability and profitability, and even return on investment, but at the same time have a social benefit. And just look at the story associated with the vaccines. And I know that the topic of access to the vaccines in low and middle income country right now is a hot topic, and whether patent rights should be suspended. There's lots of wisdom on both sides. But the reality is you have entirely new companies that barely existed 12 to 18 months ago that rode a challenge that was viewed as risky, but successfully delivered on a solution. And those investors did very well by doing something good and something that moved the needle on the COVID problem, as an example. So in my opinion, this is not just being noble and socially responsible. This is also a way to bring social responsibility into the mainstream of business, where you almost have a redefinition of philanthropy. You don't have to give the money away, strictly speaking. You can also look at this as an investment in the technologies and the solutions that are going to create the unicorns of tomorrow.
Maurizio, so well said. And it's a perfect segue to the third area that you're involved in, the third sort of hat that you wear in this incredible leadership journey that you're on. And that is, along with Terasaki and the Washington Global Health Alliance, you also help to co-found AdAstral Ventures. And what sort of impact have you seen come out of AdAstral, and how is it aligned to the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
Sure. Well, thank you for bringing that up. So let me first of all suggest that AdAstral is it's a soon-to-be fund. It's under formation. And it's intended to put to practice pretty much all of the things I just talked to you about. It's focused on solving some of the world's most daunting problems. So it has this sort of impact orientation, but it's intending to do it through the use of essentially for-profit capital and the creation of companies that ultimately use the strategy of finding these solutions to these really large problems to achieve incredible scale. And so it's been described as a moonshot factory. Maybe I'll change that to Marshot factory, although I don't want to interfere with Elon's ambitions. And the idea is to really curate
the problem sets for which there are solutions incubating, including incubating in institutions, in academia, in research, in foundations, etc., that can be combined and ultimately launched as private sector entities, but that will commit to a double bottom line. So one of the sort of novelties of AdAstral is that it's probably the first example of an impact venture capital fund. And we use quantitative metrics to think about impact so that they become part of that sort of return on investment calculus, the same way as a financial statement becomes part of that calculus. We are convinced that an investment in a fund like AdAstral, and that uses this sort of strategy of high impact, high return, or high reward, is going to actually provide financial returns in addition to these impact returns at an unprecedented scale. And of course, we have some history before AdAstral was AdAstral of putting some of this to practice, and it becomes a unique platform for collaboration, because both industrial partners, investors, private sectors, and even academic and research communities would be able to lean on AdAstral as a source of capital to really perform that translational experience that I discussed at the very beginning in connection with Terasaki, and really achieve scale. And a lot of the architects of the AdAstral fund are sort of visionaries that have spent a long time incubating the idea of how do you do impact and impact investing without turning it into charity, therefore providing a real opportunity for the private sector to scale things up. But on the other hand, by creating companies that are at the same time sustainable and equitable in the process. So that's a quick pitch on what we're trying to do with AdAstral. As you can imagine, it sort of is, if you think about this sort of ecosystem that I've described as a triumvirate, you have a research institutions that is performing translational research in the work that I'm doing with the Terasaki Institute. You have an alliance of institutions that are committed to sort of global problem resolution in what we're doing with the Global Health Alliance. And you now have a source of capital that can not only support those institutions, but can support many others. And all of that is part of creating this grand collaboration ecosystem that I think ultimately is how these solutions to these big problems will come into being. And of course, all three of these institutions have the open for business sign. The shingle is on the door. And so to your viewers, no matter which side of this whole ecosystem you're sitting on, whether it's on the investment side, whether you're sitting on the science side, whether you're in the corporate side, if you like what you're hearing, we would love to figure out how to collaborate with you. And do not hesitate to come and join us, because the success on these projects is really all about that collaboration.
Incredibly well said, Maurizio, and so well put together in terms of these three areas. If one were interested in finding out more about AdAstral or any of the other organizations, what's the best place to find information? How can they find out more information today?
Well, for AdAstral, you can simply go to www.adastral.org. And that's a good launching point. The other institutions all have their own websites, so you can easily Google them. And just as a side note, AdAstral is the result of being forced to take almost 12 years of Latin growing up in Italy and in the Italian educational system. And if you translate it, it means to the cosmos, or to the stars. And that is intended to capture the moonshot nature of what we're trying to do. We're a little more ambitious than even Moon and Mars. We're really thinking about going to the stars, and that's the genesis of the name.
Maurizio Vecchione, always the last word, changing the world. Thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for leading. And thank you for this incredible inspiration. I know our global viewership will absolutely love this. And again, for more information, AdAstral, visit their website, get more information. Changing the world, Maurizio Vecchione.
Thank you, George.